we are running. Let's get the opening logo on the road. Welcome to Evolution Hour. Maybe adjust my. Here we go. And voila. Here we are on the days almost days away from a new year, which is likely to be even bumpier than 2025 was. And this, of course, continues, ends a chapter. Chapter 17 concludes. We have only a couple technical sources on that. We'll be moving to a fresh chapter once we get back into Spokane. They're still running really badly on like around 70% technical material misapprehended. And this, of course, is a Casey Luskin episode every other week. We've got, let's see, 4 more players on the list, one of which is a theodicy matter, and the other 3 aren't doing anything other than what we've been pointing out all along so far. And then they'll put in a little bit of lagniappe about somebody I was jousting with on Twitter, aka X, on the Luke genealogy, Luke census, Quirinius census, and secondary source citation and stuff that will probably end up as a little footnote blurring around somewhere in the religion book that Jackson and I will probably be doing a little bit farther down the road after we get the conspiracy thinking book out of the way, after we get volume 2 of The Rocks Were There out of the way. We have a lot of things on our plates, but we never forget a trick on this. So anyway, good old Sarfati and Tay have only 2 technical papers rounding out this particular chapter, which is relating again to trying to diminish bird evolution. They've got a 2014 paper, which we'll be able to put the full links up on. That's from PNAS, on iguanas having a form of unidirectional airflow, past the whole theropod bird links thing that by then was simply part of the standard paleontological understanding. So it's like, you really want to bring this little puppy up? The paper wasn't trying to disprove that birds and dinosaurs might be related. It was just about a separate thing. And in fact, the paper recommended a 2010 paper from Farmer, which I will also be putting a link up to, full text, once we get back to Spokane, regarding, quote, other selective pressures for the forerunner of the avian lung should be investigated, unquote, in which he presented, quote, a scenario for the origin of both the alveolar and parabronchial lungs that explains when and how they could have arisen by a gradual sequence of steps, unquote. Sarfati and Tay pointedly did not cite, or have not so far cited, the Farmer paper, reinforcing how they are very cherry-picky in what they bring up and what they don't. But since this paper clearly discussed that matter and alluded to Farmer, and Farmer has continued to do work in other areas as well since then, it falls under the category of misrepresented source. Big surprise, la-di-da. And then they were trying exactly the same trick with a much more recent paper from Aguirre, Aguirre, unquote, from 2020. It's, in fact, an et al. Paper, and Sarfati and Tay apparently didn't notice that because they lopped off all, functionally lopped off all of the co-authors. So they were treating it as if it were just by this individual person. There's been stray issues of where it looks like Sarfati and Tay are very sloppy copyists, superficial spelling errors and things where they've not been paying too close of attention to things. And you find this less frequently, but you do find it occasionally, typographical errors, spelling glitches, and the like, in regular science papers that slip through the ring. But it occurs much more commonly at a higher incidence among creationists and other sloppy ideologues, people who are deriving too much of their material secondarily or deriving it from somebody's secondary source, from cursory reading and all that, things they've copied down in previous times that they're simply repeating. Anyway, The paper in question is from PLOS.org, and so you'll be able to get the whole thing. I'll be putting the link up for that one. And it's on dinosaur and mammal bone structure. When Sarfati and Tay are waving it at the end of the chapter with the quote that, quote, theropod bone structure more closely resembles the trabecular architecture of modern humans than that of extant avian species, unquote. So they're nicking this bit to imply that somehow this means that it's just arbitrary and irrelevant about all the bird dinosaur connections. But the problem is that they leave out the context, and they ironically in their book they left out the end quote mark, minor typographical detail on their part. But even Sarfati and Tay had to know that the paper was primarily about the bones of massive dinosaurs. We're talking big sauropods and so forth and so on. So they were comparing the dynamics of massive dinosaurs with that of birds, which are way smaller critters, to indicate that, yeah, the dynamics of those bones are more like mammals, which are much bigger animals typically. That of modern humans, human beings are substantially bigger than the average bird. And they were talking about load characteristics and a lot of other stuff. So this one was just cherry picking little bliplets out of this when it wasn't in fact about the thing they were supposed to be dealing with. La-di-da. Part two of our little show relates to our Luskin list. And so they've got some from a variety of papers in 2017 and 2018. Buranina, that we'll be putting the full link up to, of 2017. ALUs, our little pals, come up in it along with their note that, quote, discovery of bacterial analogs of the eukaryotic small ncRNAs involved in transcription regulations such as 6S RNA suggests that they possess a common evolutionary origin, unquote. Then there was Chen, which also we'll be putting the link up to. That was noting how the ALUs are cropping up in primates around 35 million years ago. Again, evolutionary context. And they outline the evolution of the particular interactions. So did Sarfati or did Luskin really want to cite this one again? This is just pointing to the evolutionary history of those ALU retrotransposons, that they make sense in a phylogenetic framework, they make sense in a mutational framework when you're looking at the individual species level. And we know by their silence on this point that the intelligent design movement authors, Luskin and all et al., have never got any within 1,000 miles of those details. They just don't think about it. ALUs have barely arisen anywhere in their literature, and certainly not as a technical description to show off how fantastically useful intelligent design theory is in explaining actual genetic data. Then there's the paper from Otteson, 2017. We'll be putting the link up to that little puppy. That one's another theodicy matter because they're talking about how ALUs contribute to glitches in a human SMN gene. And then there's one paper from 2018, Vricek, I think they're one of those charming Eastern European names where there are far too many consonants. Also, we'll be putting the full link up onto that one. And it's just on more potential ALU connections. And it was kind of leaving open the notion as to whether there might be a connection between diseases from misregulation of things and whether or not anything that was due to particular ALUs or not was kind of left up in the air. So that one I didn't classify as something that was explicitly theodicy, but it's perilously close to one. So there's the technical material going on. I don't see anybody in the live chat, so there may not be anybody on our holiday period. I mean, people should be home asleep doing all the usual things, so I expect that those that will be catching the show will be catching at a more leisurely time when they can deal with it. But anyway, while I'm in here in vacation with my relatives, there was a charming, pompous jerk on Twitter who was blustering on about the Bible and trying to evade issues. It was a secondary conversation that I was looking into because some of the people that I follow on Twitter were jousting with him. And it delved eventually into the area about, whether or not the census undertaken in Quirinius's time, according to Luke, was not contradictory with the Bethlehem birth story in Matthew. And he cited some very secondary material, including, as it turned out, a thing that I don't have in my reference bibliography. And so we'll be adding it. And this will be a matter that will be coming up later. So that's a restream comment. From Inspiring Philosophy. And he's popped up in criticisms from Apologia, certainly, and I think quite a few other critics have lobbed into him as a very self-confident, but not necessarily diligently grounded analyst of these things. But this fellow was just taking Inspiring Philosophy as absolute gospel. And it was a newer video. Exactly how new, I'm not sure, because I was only checking it out on my smartphone. But I did go through and mark down all of the sources and the particular points they were making. And this religionist was proceeding under the idea that Inspiring Philosophy's video defending how valid the Luke census was, that it didn't necessarily mean that there couldn't have been a census back in Herod's time, and that all this was actually boiling down to was the absence of something. None of the sources that Inspiring Philosophy offered could cite, because none exist, any direct evidence that a census was conducted in Judea under imperial command, under the approach that was described in Luke, at the time during Herod, which is where the Matthew Bethlehem birth story arises. And a big chunk of the material on older articles and regurgitating a lot of arguments from this, some stuff from the 1980s and some of the stuff going all the way back to like 1912 and all that. Little snippets of quotes that were used in the argument that they're kind of trying to end run somehow or other that there was an earlier census, so that they're saying that there might not have been a census of Israel when it was annexed in the 6 AD period, when Quirinius actually was governor of Syria, but that there was somehow an earlier one, that they weren't really delving into the notion, was Quirinius governor of Syria back then too? IP didn't deal with that at all. But what was really amusing from a methods point of view right off the bat, I was able to download a big chunk of the material they were drawing off of, but the really fun part had to do with a bit from Tacitus, where the secondary source was implying, or IP was implying, the secondary source was suggesting that there could have been a census in areas outside of spots that you would normally think of, even without being formally annexed, because of this statement in Tacitus about this relating to another time frame altogether. The problem is they made a point, Inspiring Philosophy made a point of sticking the quote from Tacitus up as a full bit. And if you actually stop to read it, it's not mentioning anything about census. It's just implying that something was going on in a particular province. Oh, hello, Brian. Lurking, yes. And that the Romans got involved with this somehow or other. This was a really tendentious argument to try to make. And what I'll be intrigued to see is when I'll be able to get back home and start looking at the original paper to find out whether or not that was actually the argument that they were making. And then the other one related to Egypt. Quite a few of his sources, Inspiring Philosophy sources, were arguing that multiple censuses were conducted in Egypt under Augustus. And I was just going, oh gosh, don't you understand why? And that's because, ironically, inspiring philosophy was even making a big deal about how meticulous Augustus was in recording this sort of stuff. Why then wouldn't they have recorded that there was one under Herod? None of that. Well, the reason why Egypt was coming up is the special place of Egypt in the acquisition when Octavius conquered the place from Cleopatra and Mark Antony. Egypt was the great granary cash cow. It's a big producer of wealth, but not necessarily good armies or navies. And it was such a big cash cow that Augustus, eventually Emperor Augustus, couldn't trust any governor to run it. So they didn't make it a conventional province, and it was made an imperial province that was his personal property. And so he apparently was always mindful of these things and was conducting censuses every so often, every 10, 15 years or so, just to make sure that everything was on the up and up. Eventually, it would become a conventional province later on. So bringing this up wasn't really helping their case any. And of course, inspiring philosophy was taking the position that Luke had to be taken as true unless you could actively disprove it. So it was innocent until proven guilty. No, that's not how things work in history, dear boy. It's that an assertion is made, and the absence of evidence for that assertion is to be noted, and trying to simply slip it in as though it was an automatic given and you couldn't find anything to disprove it was very flimsy indeed. The particular irony, of course, was that I personally have no problem with there having been a census at the time of Quirinius. With Israel was annexed, that was a standard procedure for the Romans to conduct a stock taking thing. The problem is, was there one during Herod's time? They have to have a Herod census, even though no census is being mentioned in the Matthew account, because Matthew and Luke are bringing completely independent approaches to try to supply the messianic credentials for Jesus. This is the background issue that, for all practical purposes, is left out of every apologetic that I've ever seen in this area. And it is occasionally mentioned by the critics who point out, Robert Lane Fox certainly did in his analysis, some in the 1990s, that the reason why the accounts in Matthew and Luke were doing this in the first place is that if they're going to argue that Jesus was the Messiah, one, he has to be born in Bethlehem, David's city. Two, he has to be of Davidic ancestry, no non-negotiations. And three, he's going to set up the kingdom of Israel again, reestablish the monarchy. Well, the Perusia, definitely didn't happen, and that's another thing that gets left in the sideline. But the point is that Matthew and Luke are the only accounts anywhere in the Gospels that are trying to supply the credentials for, one, the Davidic ancestry, and two, the Bethlehem birth story. Why was Jesus of Nazareth born in Bethlehem? Well, the Luke approach is to say, oh, there was a census, which there presumably was in 6 or 7 AD, CE, if you want to look at it that way. But the question is, why Bethlehem, not Nazareth? So it's the Luke story that has Joseph and Mary having to go back to their ancestral homeland, which is residence, which is Bethlehem, if they are of Davidic ancestry. So the Bethlehem story is just an interpolation by Luke that's perfectly consistent with the lore, but strained to begin with, because there is no indication, certainly nothing offered by inspiring philosophy, that indicated that any Roman census required you to go back to your ancestral digs, only to your place of residence, which would have been Nazareth, not Bethlehem. And he just doesn't deal with that issue at all, and therefore the secondary Twitter person is not dealing with it. And then, of course, you have the alternate count in Matthew, which doesn't have anything at all about censuses. It's the stuff with the star in the sky and Herod's slaughter of the innocents, another detail for which there is no historical evidence. Yeah, it was a neat idea to saddle Herod, who was a nasty, murderous person, with this thing, but it's so nasty and so murderous that you wonder why Josephus, who couldn't stand Herod, managed to miss it. That's because it would presumably never happen. It was just the Matthew, whoever was actually writing, air quotes, Matthew, is taking the Moses story and interpolating it into Jesus context. But of course, the problem being that Herod died long before 6 AD. He didn't even make it to 1 AD. And so they've got this taffy pull going on there, plus the genealogies of Jesus going through Joseph in both genealogies don't match. And this has been another contradiction, which, as far as I've been able to notice, primarily Protestant conservatives use the argument that Luke's genealogy is actually that of Mary. And so we have Mary descended through Nathan, and then it's Joseph descended through Solomon. And contradiction resolved simply by rewriting the text in Luke, which I suppose was frowned upon, thing you're not supposed to do. So it's some ingenious little bits, but it just shows the tendentiousness of so many of these apologists to try to shoehorn and buff and maneuver to get themselves into a position to be able to sustain this thing in what is still a problematic contradiction. Because we can say objectively that Luke, which is purporting to be a secondary account that's drawing on eyewitness accounts that are not named, and we have no corroborating material to cross-check, and documents of character that he doesn't identify and that don't exist to where we can cross-check any of that. But nonetheless, secondary account doesn't have anything of the Matthew story, none of it. So either Luke, as a secondary redactor, didn't know about the Matthew story, and it wasn't part of the basic lore that he was compiling for his gospel, assuming it was Luke, very problematic. They're just attributed to those names subsequently. Or he was aware of the Matthew story and thought it cockamamie twaddle and didn't include it. The same reason that you have stuff in the Apocrypha and all these other things that didn't get into finished canon. That, to me, as a historian looking at it, is no way around that. And yet, somebody of the inspiring philosophy mentality and a Twitter believer riffing off of that follows it up and swallows it hook, line, and sinker. Anyway, it was sufficiently varied. Whenever there's any source like that that makes an argument that is having material that's not in my reference bibliography, there was only a couple of the sources that were alluded to that were. And so most of IP's secondary source list were fresh and new to me. And so we naturally had to write them down and track them down. And I'm able to get quite a lot of material on the subject. So it will presumably be subject of that whole bit. There's just a pile up of stuff on the apologetics of that rationalization. And that will certainly be covered in the future religion book when we're getting around to dealing with the God of Abraham side of things. And there will probably be similar issues that we will be raising with non-God of Abraham stuff. Hinduism, various tribal religions and all that, fill in the blank over the roughly 6,000 to 10,000 years of any of the moderately extant religions. And then, of course, it's leaving the whole issue of why do we have religions at all? What's going on in our brains when we do that? How much role is culture playing? How early in the human lineage did religious elements develop? Would it surprise me that the human species has been functionally, generally religious, supernatural thinking from the get-go of our genus? Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me at all. And would it surprise me even that it extends to some extent into the Australopithecines? Also not surprising. We can only go on symbolic behavior and that sort of thing to try to piece together that and then cross-reference it with the issues of our brain systems and how they have developed and what the presumed history is how long they've been running. So it's going to be an interesting little sidebar. Judging from just the notes that I have on the subjects, It wouldn't surprise me that the religion book will be a 3-volume affair. But that will be some ways down the road because we still have all that cute stuff to go on the conspiracy thinking stuff, which relates to climate science denial and conspiracy thinking and from flat Earth and all the other. We'll be functionally having a taxonomy of how crazy loony the conspiracy is versus how socially destructive and salient the belief system is. And so something like flat Earth is shooting off the index for, you gotta be kidding me that you still believe this. But it's almost completely irrelevant in modern society. You can find an occasional public figure, some sports person or pundit who has flat Earth proclivities, and 10, 15, maybe 20% varying. People might still have that largely from religious grounds. They tend to be biblical literalists who take their flat Earth geocentrism seriously. But apart from their potential role as Trump voters, they're not really very salient. Somewhat down the list and not quite so overtly preposterous, but still wrong, would be the anti-vaxxer crowd. But unlike flat earthers, they shoot off the index for danger because they're actually affecting people's lives, their livelihood. There's concerns about the health of people. This could lead to deaths. And we're seeing this measured in a gruesome way with RFK Jr. Being head of our health system and the various anti-vaxxers that have been drawn into the Operation Bhattacharya and all that crowd that has earned some in-depth dissection by Professor Dave Farina that indicates just how far removed from things. But I had spotted how bad of a method RFK Jr. had quite a ways ago about how he was clearly riffing off of secondary sources in exactly the way that we see bad method for all of our other crowd. So I managed to blither blather on for 27 minutes here. Let us put our thank you note for our people who have been with us in the Patreon, bearing in mind that this is a time of trial for everybody. And so the fact that there are people who are continuing to shell out real cash researchers, assistant researchers, friends, as well as all the various legacy patrons that have helped along the way. I am very mindful and thankful of how that is a vote of confidence and that I will attempt to continue to earn all of your trust. But if there's ever a circumstance in the upcoming mess, whether there have been 80 people measles outbreak, and that's absolutely correct, that we've got a circumstance where things that were functionally eradicated because we maintained a high level of vaccination are now resurging. And people, of course, the Samoan case of where people were dying from measles due to RFK Jr.'s claptrap a few years back, that the people who go on about this stuff have no idea how vaccination protocols work. From an evolutionary point of view, in order to discourage viruses from being able to mutate fast enough to evade your medicines, you need to have a really high level of vaccination that basically acts as a scorched earth that weeds out the potential mutations in the virus faster than it can accumulate. You go lower, and the medical advisor there in Florida, who's also I think has moved into the administration and been writing stuff, was arguing, well, it's just personal choice. And Tucker Carlson and these other people say it's just choice. They should have the freedom to do that. Well, if they choose to do so at too low a level, dropping down into the 70% range and lower, now the viruses can mutate fast enough that your attempts to slow them down by the vaccines no longer works as well. And there's detailed analyses that have been done on the epidemiology of all this stuff for a very, very long time, of which apparently the anti-vaxxers are clueless. And their ignorance and overconfidence is at flat earth level bad in so many instances. There's a very small cadre, by the way. You've only got maybe about a dozen core fact claimants in the anti-vaxxer movement, which is smaller than the number of people who are fact claimants, major ones in the creationism movement. Theoretically, analysts in the area, Jason Colavito or somebody like Flint Dibble, could probably burrow in and find out how many fact claimant level people there are in the areas they study, whether it's UFOs and ancient astronaut crowds, Graham Hancock crowd, and all of that. A lot of them may have really small fact claimant zones. By fact claimant, I mean that the people who are making the actual core claim argument, whether right or wrong or documented or not, but the point is they're the originator of the trope. And then everybody downstream of that are secondary source addict copyists. When you go farther down the road, you're getting into people who are, well, you're standing for truth level in the creationism movement, where they're name dropping, they're repeating tropes, they're repeating technical papers that the creationists they're copying have been relying on. They're very insular but detailed. You have to drop farther down to the kind of generic name dropper who's maybe aware of Michael Behe, and they'll maybe mention the irreducible complexity. They'll mention tropes like the Cambrian explosion, et cetera, but they're not exactly going out of their way to discuss a lot, and they may or may not have actually read much of the material that they're troping. And then you get way down to the bottom feeder level, of which I would put Tucker Carlson as an example, who is an anti-evolutionist who blither blathers that there's no fossil record of evolution and biology is giving it all up, and that never name drops anything, doesn't mention any of the jargon details. I don't think he's got within 100 miles of actually reading a book in this area. He may have read Ann Coulter's Godless. He may have read Philip Johnson or Michael Behe, but if it did, it hasn't stuck enough in the head that he would drop that as ammunition. So he would be a typical example of the lower level bottom feeder zone. And so anybody that's dealing in this pseudoscience department that wants to get a little more sophisticated about the analysis should do that kind of taxonomy of working out who the fact claimants are and working out the triage levels of who's copying from whom and how the daisy chains operate. And then there are, of course, social networks and how they're interacting in politics and anything other of these zones. Some of them operate in certain countries and not in others. There's a branch of super civilization Hinduism that figures in Modi's world in India. You have similar views of that, of people operating in Erdogan's Turkey, and you have Christian nationalists in Europe that rail on anti-Semitism issues, and others that are having impact on individual areas in that. So it's always important to try to piece together the connective networks and sinews that go on in terms of cross connections, because the farther down you go past the core groups, your Answers in Genesis crowds, or the Heritage Foundation, if you're thinking about Project 2025, when you get farther down to the grassroots, and particularly in that blurry zone of secondary source addicts down to the bottom feeder level, that can surge back and forth across very broad ranging stuff. So you can find hyper-conservative creationists blithering on about UFOs in relation to Nephilims in the Bible, and you can have ancient astronaut lore and pyramid magic and all sorts of stuff cross-fertilizing at that level in ways that are sometimes hilarious and sometimes just pathetic. So I urge anybody in this area that has a specific axe to grind and an area that they're studying as a thing anyway, to press into that zone of working on the source methods taxonomy of what material they're relying on, who's copying who, and all of that. So that's my continual methodology urge. Let us put up advertisement for The Rocks Were There Volume 1. And hopefully by spring of next year, Volume 2 out of the way. I'm practically at the end of our cosmology chapter, I was just finishing up material on Saturn's rings and the kind of goalpost moving that's been taking place in a certain extent by creationists in that area. And then there'll be some material on exoplanets and the like. And at that point, I can throw that out to some technical people to fact check, make sure that I got all my ducks in a row, and get on to dealing with incorporating my material into the next chapter that Jackson has just had completed earlier and has been waiting for me to get to add my material in on the whales and the Grand Canyon and all that. So anyway, commercial. The cosmology chapter, I think, is kind of to some extent a revelation for me. I knew there were relatively few creationists who dibble dabble in the cosmology things, who actually have astronomy degrees and all of that. They're not operating at Kent Hovind imaginary degree level, and they've actually published in technical journals and sometimes fairly recently to boot. But they're all at loggerheads about what all of cosmology they've accepted and not. Generally speaking, the older crowd, like Russell Humphreys, kind of sticks to his guns and is moving his cosmology from one rock to another as he develops something, and then it turns out to be yet more problems, and so it's just a constant goalpost moving. Down to Danny Faulkner, who is kind of the one who is saying, well, you really do need to accept dark matter, you really need to accept dark energy, and you really need to accept this and that and thus and so. And there's a lot of curious goalpost moving, often bringing up issues in times gone by and then dropping them to where they aren't using them as frequently. That Saturn example is kind of fading. Saturn rings. The most recent studies are the creationists have been putting out have kind of turned to different aspects of Saturn rings, not saying that just because they're 100 million years old that therefore the universe has to be young. And then you've got the kind of core lead in that the answers books, which include various ones from various creationists, Jason Lyle and all that over the years, do in an average answers book, there's maybe one or two chapters that will deal with cosmology issues. Superficially, tendentiously, contradictorily, as they goalpost move from one book to another and change their where Setterfield's pliable speed of light is heavily promoted in one of the earlier books and disappears completely from later ones. So it's an intriguing thing to see this little hopscotch that goes on. And I think it's more overtly blatant in the cosmology area than in almost any other area the creationists deal with. Paleontology and biology and the genetic stuff, the kind of the tropes that they're building off of date way back to the earliest days of anti-evolutionism. And it's essentially origins or bust and God of the gaps and that sort of stuff. But the cosmology angle deals with so much highly technical material and observational stuff that is accumulating at a blinding pace now with the new telescopes that come along, that they can't grease the wheels on the goalposts to move them fast enough to keep up with the material. So there is just in hilarious disarray in this area. And I think it'll be really nice compendium because I want to have this chapter to be as thoroughly up to date in terms of technical arguments on material, from everything to formation of the solar system and in our neighborhood, all the way up to the grand picture of galaxies and all that forming early in the universe, and the philosophical issue of the anthropic argument that's going to be getting a very massive breakdown in this new book. And I was genuinely surprised at how bad the anthropic argument is when you really started to look at the primary claims, and how the recent literature on so many of these supposedly fine-tuned constants has just upended the whole debate. So it's going to be really delightful. Anybody familiar with Rocks 1, with all the cute charts that we had in there listing off the feathered dinosaur genera and all of that, we'll be seeing more interesting little charts, including a list of the creationist dates for the flood that was another big surprise, is that there's although you might not realize it because AIG and ICR and CMI kind of stick with that Bishop Usser 2348 BCE date, but across the broader field of creationism, the dates just are all over the place and only partly depend on them relying on the various translations, where the Septuagint and the Masoretic texts and that have different dates for the patriarchs and stuff, ages. And so if you try to work out the creation week from them, you can be hundreds of years difference or 1,000 or more. So anyway, that gives you a little bit of a foretaste of what's going to be going on there. Theoretically, then, our next show will be back in my den with the books and the CDs behind me. And we will be then able to put all the links in for this episode and the last week's episode after we've dried out from the New Year's and welcomed in 2026 and fastened our seat belts for what is, I fear, going to be an extremely contentious and bumpy ride that is going to upset and unnerve an awful lot of people, including a great many overconfident MAGA who were not going to expect things to so much shit to hit so many fans so quickly, as I fear is going to happen in 2026, which is, after all, going to be an election year coming up in November. So it's going to be bumpy. And the Trumpistas are going to try to do everything in their power to gerrymander and voter suppress and tinker with things to try to keep their slim majority. We'll see what happens then, and then farther down the road in the 2028 election, which will have to be somebody other than Trump unless he's planning on abrogating the Constitution. Will that put me past him? Or who gets in the wings? J.D. Vance scrambling to be the heir apparent. Will his career go the same way as Pence? Vance is in many respects a scarier figure than Trump because he's a true believer, a Christian nationalist, hyper-conservative Catholic convert fellow. And of course, his little puppet master, Peter Thiel, is filled full of weird conspiracy theories. And this is nutball central going on in there. So I do not, if you remove Trump under the 25th Amendment, you just get Vance. And Vance is no improvement. In some respects, he might even be more dangerous insofar as he's not suffering from dementia. So he could be more conscious in that area. So anyway, there's a full out 3/4 of an hour show and discussions of this and that and thus and so. And everybody continue to stay safe if you're in spots that have bad weather and ick, which is often the case of these things. Be careful. And if you're concerned about the ICE Gestapo and these various other groups running amok in your particular region, also be very, very careful. We have a somewhat more civilized and buffered zone up here in my Washington state, and by hell or high water, we plan on keeping it that way. And others can watch our things. Yes, Vance is also power hungry. Yes, he is an Aaron Burr type. Brian, he's somebody who, Aaron Burr apparently didn't believe in anything, just power. That's as Alexander Hamilton had his run-ins with him. But Landers and all and sundry. Okay. Anyway, everybody, we will be ending our stream, and we will catch you again in another week, unless the asteroid hits or second coming occurs, or who knows what else. So, au revoir, and watch out for the wooden penguins. Ending the stream.